We've almost completed our model of the macroeconomy. We're almost ready to find the equilibrium price level and output and see how changes in the environment can generate a business cycle and what policy can do to encourage more output and growth. But what we need to add now is the long-run aggregate supply curve, a curve that answers the question, what is the relationship between the aggregate price level and output in the economy in the long run after all prices have completed the process of adjustment? Recall that the process of adjustment may proceed in a jerky fashion. Goods prices may be rising faster than labor prices. Raw materials prices are rising at a different rate. But the long run is when all of those prices have completed their adjustment and the general price level in the economy has risen, say by 10%. Once all prices have risen by 10%, what would we expect businesses to do in response? Well, think about it. Businesses are out to make a profit, and profit is the difference between revenue and costs. Goods prices determine your revenue, materials and labor prices determine your costs. And if all of those prices rise at the same rate, there's been no change in the relative prices of output and inputs. There is no new opportunity for profit. You're back where you started. So, in the long run, after all prices have completed their adjustment, there's no new opportunity for profit. Businesses are back in the same position in which they started, and we would imagine that they would choose the same output level that they were choosing before. So in the long run, there's no relationship between the aggregate price level and the level of output. The long-run aggregate supply curve is a vertical line. So if we want to draw that vertical line in our diagram, the next question we have is, where does it go? Where should we put the long-run aggregate supply curve? Should it be over here, close to the axis, or out here, further away? The answer depends on how much output the economy can produce when all resources are fully employed. We're now going to define the concept of full employment output. Full employment output is the output of the economy when all resources are employed, perhaps all employed in their best uses. See, now we're starting to get into some fuzzy stuff because you can always work people harder, right? You can always go try to find more materials. But there's a notion of full employment output when everyone who wants to work is working as hard as they want, and all materials that are relatively inexpensive to get to have been employed, that nothing is being wasted. That's the idea. The output that we can produce when nothing is being wasted. You can always push the economy harder and try to make more, but that means paying people who don't want to work to come get a job, or climbing further up the mountain to cut down more trees. So the full employment level of output can be thought of as a kind of speed limit to the economy. This is the amount of output that we can produce when all resources are employed. If we go faster than the speed limit, then we run the risk of inflation, that is, pushing up prices. And if we go below the speed limit, then we've got unemployment, and the prices will tend to drop over time. Over time, wages will even tend to drop if there's unemployment in the labor market. So, the speed limit of the economy, full employment output, depends on two things. First, the resource pool. How much labor is there? How much raw materials do we have to work with in our economy? So if you combine labor and raw materials, these two things together determine the resource base of the economy. Next, what you want to, also another important resource is capital. I could put a hammer in this picture and we'd have all of our resources represented. The other important component that determines full employment output is technology. That is, our skill or ability to turn these resources into output. The better our technology, the more output we can produce with a given quantity of resources. So, take your resources and take your technology, put them together, and that determines full employment output, the output that's produced when all resources in the economy are fully employed. Think of that as a speed limit to the economy. You can go faster, you can go slower, but if you do, you're in a situation that's unstable. Prices are going to start to adjust, and other things are going to be, other changes set in motion. So let's go ahead then and draw our curve to represent the long-run aggregate supply curve. And here it is. It's a vertical curve, and I label it LRAS for long-run aggregate supply. and I'll call this 0 because this is my original one. And the long-run aggregate supply curve then represents the output of the economy when all resources are fully employed. In the long run, we're going to wind up back on this green curve. I've colored it green to remind us that the economy is constrained by the natural environment. All of our resources come from the natural environment, and that natural environment determines how much output we can produce, given our technology. So now what we're ready to do is we're ready to put the short-run aggregate supply curve and the long-run aggregate supply curve together and find out what will cause them to shift. Before I put the short-run supply curve in this diagram, let's think about what would shift the long-run aggregate supply curve. What would change the speed limit of the economy? What would allow us to produce more output at any given price level? And the answer here is a change in our resource base or a change in technology. If we get more resources, say there is immigration of labor, more labor comes and joins our economy. Now we can produce more output than we could before. Or if we get more raw materials in the economy, that's going to be an increase in our resource base. An increase in the resource base for a given technology shifts the long-run aggregate supply curve outwards. That is, it shifts here over to the right. If there should be a reduction in the resource base due to a war, then the long-run aggregate supply curve shifts inwards. Now, let's put the long-run and short-run aggregate supply curve together in one picture and see what happens. So let me go ahead and draw my short-run aggregate supply curve. And remember, the slope of the short-run aggregate supply curve reflects the impact that the price level has on output in the short run. When people are confused and when there are fixed wages and sticky prices, we get this short-run aggregate supply curve. So in the short run, we always have to be on the blue curve. If the price level is to increase, then in the short run, we're going to get an increase in output because people aren't sure whether it's just their sector or inflation across the economy. Also because wages are fixed, so businesses see a profit opportunity. Also because of sticky prices, there's going to be an increase in output as some people keep their prices low relative to the overall rising price level because of the cost of adjustment. So you're always going to be on the blue curve. But in the long run, you've got to be on the green curve as well. We'll see how we get there when we talk about the process of adjustment after we've put demand and supply together and found equilibrium. But we've got one more thing that we need to address, and that is what causes these curves to shift. Suppose there's an increase in resources in our economy due to immigration. What's going to happen then is the long-run aggregate supply curve is going to shift outwards, like we talked about before. And we're going to have a new long-run aggregate supply curve, and I can label that long-run aggregate supply curve 1. The level of full employment output in that case has increased. We've increased from YF0 to YF1. The new higher level of full employment output is due to an increase in the resource base. You'd get the same result if you had an improvement in technology. If technology were to improve, we would get an outward shift in the long-run aggregate supply curve. Notice that anytime you shift the long-run aggregate supply curve, it pulls the short-run aggregate supply curve with it. So the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts as well. So I can label this SRAS1. If the long-run aggregate supply curve were to shift inwards due to a war, it would also pull the short-run curve with it. So anything that shifts the long-run aggregate supply curve shifts the short-run aggregate supply curve along with it. It's as if they are attached right here at this point. Now, there's one more thing to consider, and that is that the short-run aggregate supply curve can change on its own power. That is, if we were to go back to our original set of curves, that is the long-run aggregate supply curve here and the short-run aggregate supply curve, then the short-run aggregate supply curve can change due to a change in expectations. This is the factor that can shift the short-run aggregate supply curve on its own. Suppose everyone, due to some change in the environment, decides that prices are actually falling. They expect a lower price level. What's going to start to happen is that workers, in order to remain competitive, will be willing to accept smaller wage increases. What happens also is that my business, trying to stay ahead of your business, is going to try to lower its prices first. Everybody, if they think that prices are falling, is going to move quickly to lower prices ahead of everyone else. What happens then when people expect lower prices is they build those expectations into their decisions, into their negotiations, into their wage contracts, and so forth, so that the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts downwards so that you can get a given level of output now at a lower price level. This is the one thing that shifts the short-run aggregate supply curve independently of the long-run aggregate supply curve, people's expectations about the price level. Once we start talking about the adjustment process, we'll see that the short-run aggregate supply curve frequently moves independently of the green curve, especially if you've created inflation by trying to go faster than the speed limit. But in the meantime, we can keep in mind a summary that says that anything that shifts the long-run aggregate supply curve pulls the short-run aggregate supply curve with it. And the factor that shifts the short-run aggregate supply curve independently of the long-run aggregate supply curve is people's expectation about the price level. Prices going down, if that's expected, the SRAS shifts down. If people are expecting inflation soon, they preempt it by pushing prices up now, shifting the SRAS up. So now we know what these curves mean, why they slope the way they do, and what can cause them to shift. We're ready now to introduce the aggregate demand curve and calculate an equilibrium. So we'll be doing that next.